Welcome, everybody. Thank you, Dr. Cole. You're most articulate and clearly drawing from a deep well of experience. So thank you. When I was asked to share a story tonight, I said, I don't have a story to tell. And then it was like, I don't know which story to tell. There've been so many. And when I think about the story of a time when I'm sitting at the bedside of another who's dying, I realize that the more provocative stories for me have been stories about people that are not necessarily dying, but they're living. They're struggling in some way, and I think it's all relevant, whether we're talking to someone who's dying or just living their lives. I thought of many stories. The first story that came to mind was my father, who died 15 years ago, who was a big man, loved the physical world, and was a hunter and a skier and a, manly man. And his life was diminished considerably by a series of strokes and heart attack and diabetes. And I had him up here in Canada years ago, in the last year of his life. And I was doing what I thought was best. I was keeping him warm and safe, providing good company, feeding him well, giving my mother a break. One day, I had him outside on his wheelchair, and we were chatting, and the storms came, and I started to wheel him inside, and he said, "Leave me here." And I said, "Dad, you'll get cold. This is not a good idea. Leave me here." So I left him in the storm, this big storm, and it rained down on his head, and he sat out there for a good 45 minutes, and eventually brought him inside, and it was the medicine that he needed that took him from a place of despondency to a place of peace. Just that little rainstorm. Who would know? I thought about Sid, who I met 35 years ago in San Francisco at an almshouse in the city. You probably know Laguna Honda. It's no longer there. And but I met him in his home, and he was in the last weeks of his life. And I would come in and I would deliver groceries or make sure that he was warm and safe, maybe fix him a cup of tea. One day I walked in and something was different. The whole mood and flavor of the space was quite different. And he seemed quite despondent and agitated. I went over to Sid and I sat down and I tried to fluff a pillow and make him comfortable. Nothing seemed to work. He told me about the quilt that was on the wall that was made by his grandmother. I had an instinct to pull it off the wall, and I wrapped him in it. And I sat down next to him, and I picked up his hand, and I started to cry, and he started to cry. And he died a week later. And I think he died with some peace, and I came home with an incredible gift. There was the janitor a couple of years ago when my appendix broke, and I was in the Trail Hospital feeling very lonely and afraid, and he was cleaning my room, and he was whistling a tune. And when he left, I said, "I really liked your singing, your whistling." And that afternoon, I was in a very sad state, and I was missing my friends and in a lot of pain, emotional and physical. He came in at the end of his shift with his guitar, and he serenaded me through my dinner hour. And then there was my mother, who was dealing with a lot of anxiety and fear in the last days of her life. And amongst all the beepers and the drugs and the visitors that were coming and going, she called me over and she sat me down and she said, "Sandi, will you tell me about my dying?" And it was the most profound exchange I've ever had with anybody. And I felt her love. She died a day later, and I'll never forget that moment. But the big story I want to tell, and that's just me, isn't it, Jane? I can't just tell one story. If it's okay, I just want to share with you that a year ago, I was in Germany with my daughter, and she was having the last of her cancer treatments in an old, run-down hospital that had been through several wars and was pockmarked full of ammunition and bombs, and it was a very dreary sight. And I had my notions about what this might be like, and I'd hoped for her to have this last series of treatments in a shiny Canadian hospital with all of the everythings. And But I had to let that go and try and just meet her where she was and what was unfolding in front of me. And in a way, that old hospital reminded me of the preciousness and the fragility of life every time I walked through the front door. So it was part of the healing for me. Ashley had a roommate. Again, I'd hoped that she would have a private room. It was just my idea of what needed to happen. But I very soon learned that I didn't have a clue as to what needed to happen, and I stepped out of the way. Because that roommate, when she came in, she sat down in her room bed, another 30-year-old with cancer. And she put down her pictures of her family and her special pillow, because she was going to be there for a week for treatments. And she started a conversation with her broken English and my daughter with her broken German, and started to talk about their journey as two young women with cancer. And I thought that because I was her mother and that I loved her so deeply, that somehow I could be in that world with her, that that's all it would take. And love can take you pretty far, but that was not a world that I could enter into. And so I was deeply grateful for this young woman and this opportunity for them to share their journey together. Another surprise. There was Ashley, who looked at me that first day, and she could tell that I felt vulnerable and a little afraid. And she said to me, in her state, that she was dealing with pain and her own vulnerabilities and fears, she said, "Mom, would you like to look at my special breast, the one that's been through radiation and chemo and surgeries?" And the courageousness and the generosity in that moment left me feeling a love for her that I thought I could never go that deep. And I thanked her for that. After surgery, Ashley needed to be bathed. And I said, "Ashley, would you welcome me bathing you?" And she said, "I would love that, Mom." In the shower, I washed her body down, and there was a kind of an intimacy with her body and with all that she'd been through and her whole story, that she was willing to expose herself to me and share with me. And that was another beautiful moment of healing that I won't forget. But it was the final day. It was the final day. It was after 4 days of these two girls who had ended up becoming sisters during this time and receiving the most dreadful meals of butter and bread and cheese and yogurt and coffee. And I thought to myself, this is not going to do. So I came in one morning, the night before my last day with them, with menus that I had collected from restaurants around the community that I'd got to know in my walks. And I said, "Circle whatever you want, and I'm going to go out and I'm going to make for a really nice meal, for our last meal together." So the following morning, we had a lovely morning, shared photos, and they gave me their menus, and I took off for the afternoon, and I went to the restaurant, and I dropped off the menu, and I spoke to the owner, and I said, "This is what's going on right now. Would you be willing to put together a couple of meals for these two lovely ladies, and for me too, and I'll pick it up later?" And that's all I told him. And then I went off in search of tablecloths and flowers and music and a good bottle of wine. And when I came back to the restaurant, the owner came out, and he said, "Could you wait a moment?" And I waited a moment, and I waited another moment, and the next thing I knew, the entire staff had come out to the front room with a big basket. And each of one of them had played a hand in filling that basket, not only with the food that I'd ordered, but a special dessert for all three of us, a bottle of wine, a baguette, candles, crystal, a tablecloth. And they each came up to me and hugged me and thanked me for that opportunity. And then I went outside, and there was a taxi that they'd paid for. That took me to the hospital with this basket. When I walked into the room, Ashley and her roommate lit up. They were clearly waiting for hours for this meal. And I walked in, and I said, "Dinner's here." And Ashley looked at the basket, looked at her roommate, and said, See, I told you it was going to be special. That's because my mother does everything this way. And I felt so loved. It was such a moment for me. And so I set up the table with the tablecloth and the wine and the candlesticks, not the candlesticks, I actually had a candle on my app on my phone that I put on the table because you couldn't have real fire. And I set up the table in a beautiful way. And this nervous roommate of hers, the little German girl, said, "Are we breaking any rules?" And we said, and Ashley said, "Don't you worry. This is our time. You can have whatever you want. Be strong. Ask for what you want." And so we sat down, we opened up the bottle of wine, we said grace, started our meal, and a nurse came in with all of her medications, her pills, and all of the other things that keep us well too. But she stopped in her tracks when she saw this. And the little German roommate looked at this and she said, "Uh-oh, we're in trouble." And the nurse looked and she stood for a moment. She saw what was happening and she stepped out. We resumed our dinner and our wine and our chatter. And after a few minutes, the door opened again and there were half a dozen practitioners and nurses and doctors peering over each other's shoulders through the door. And they just stood and watched us while we drank our wine and we listened to our music. And I looked up and there was one nurse in particular that started to cry. And I knew that I could see this was healing for so many people. This little simple story that moved the hearts of the restaurateurs and myself and Misha Ashley and her roommate, the nurses and the practitioners that perhaps don't see that very often. And they quietly closed the door and let us finish our dinner. When I said goodnight and said goodbye, as I was flying back to Canada the next day, Ashley held me and she thanked me. And I thanked her for all of the gifts that I was going home with. And she thanked me for all of the healing that had happened in that room the last 4 days. And her roommate shared that she would be going back to her family as well in a few days, to a husband who abused her and beat her. And that because of our time together, she felt prepared to meet her fears and reclaim her life. I'm grateful for the things that are in bottles that modern medicine can heal. And I know that there's nothing in a bottle that could have touched the healing or happened during our time in that worn-out hospital in Germany. Well, what do dying people need? What does anyone need? That's really the question. When you meet someone in the street, it doesn't matter what place in the trajectory of your living and dying you are, because we're all, once we're born, dying a little bit every day. It's a really good question to ask. Thank you.